Imagine a man whose legacy was so powerful that not even death could contain the impact of his life. His story is filled with miracles, the multiplication of resources, healing the sick, victory over enemies, and even raising the dead. This is Elisha, the prophet of God in the Old Testament, whose extraordinary journey is one of the most fascinating and mysterious in the Bible. Elisha not only continued the work of Elijah, his mentor, but performed deeds that still leave scholars and readers in awe. And the most intriguing part, one of his greatest miracles happened after his death. How could a man who served God in life be so impactful that even his bones were used to bring a dead man back to life? Join us on this journey full of mysteries and revelations as we uncover the details of this prophetic figure, his obedience, his miracles, and the spiritual meaning of his story. Prepare to meet Elisha, the man whose ministry demonstrated that the power of God transcends life, death, and the impossible. Elisha's story begins during a time of great significance for the people of Israel, a period when idolatry and corruption were deeply rooted in society. In his infinite wisdom, God chose men like Elijah to confront this reality and bring the people back to him. However, Elijah's time as the principal prophet was drawing to a close, and God had already prepared his successor. In 1 Kings 19:19-21, we find the account of Elisha's calling, a story that shows how God calls and equips those who are willing to obey. Elisha was a farmer, someone living a simple yet prosperous life. The text tells us he was plowing with 12 pairs of oxen, which not only indicates his role as a rural worker, but also suggests he had considerable resources. 12 pairs of oxen were a sign of wealth and stability in his time, showing that Elisha had much to lose by accepting God's call. Despite this, when Elijah, under divine guidance, finds Elisha in the field, something extraordinary happens. Elijah simply throws his cloak over him, a seemingly simple act, but full of significance. This cloak represented prophetic authority and calling, and by placing it on Elisha, Elijah was signifying that he would be the next to bear the weight of the responsibility of being God's prophet. What happens next is a clear example of immediate and total obedience. Elisha does not hesitate to respond to the call. He leaves the oxen, runs after Elijah, and asks only for a moment to say goodbye to his family. In 1 Kings 19:20, Elisha says, "Let me kiss my father and my mother goodbye, and then I will follow you." Elijah responds, "Go back, for what have I done to you?" This dialogue shows that the decision was entirely Elisha's, without pressure or coercion. And Elisha makes his choice. He sacrifices the oxen, burns the plowing equipment to cook the meat, and offers a meal to the people, a symbolic act representing his total renunciation of his old life. He was literally burning his bridges with the past to follow God's call. From that moment on, Elisha becomes Elijah's disciple. He accompanies him for years, learning from him and witnessing his powerful connection with God. This preparation was essential, as the role of a prophet in Israel was not just to deliver divine messages, but also to confront kings and nations, often at great personal risk. During this time, Elisha learns to trust completely in God, a quality he would later demonstrate in his own ministry. The transition from Elijah's ministry to Elisha's is narrated dramatically and meaningfully in 2 Kings 2. The chapter begins with Elijah knowing his time on earth is coming to an end. He departs from Gilgal and begins a journey that takes him to several important cities: Bethel, Jericho, and finally the Jordan River. At each stage, Elijah tries to convince Elisha to stay behind, saying, "Stay here, for the Lord has sent me to Bethel." However, Elisha insists on continuing, saying, "As surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you." This determination demonstrates Elisha's loyalty to his mentor and his commitment to God's call. This journey is not just physical, it is also spiritual. Each city holds symbolic significance, representing important milestones in Israel's history and walk with God. Upon reaching the Jordan, Elijah performs a miracle reminiscent of Moses and Joshua's deeds. He takes his cloak, rolls it up, and strikes the water, which parts, allowing the two of them to cross on dry ground. This act once again confirms God's power working through Elijah and sets the stage for what is to come. After crossing the Jordan, Elijah asks Elisha, "What can I do for you before I am taken from you?" Recognizing the magnitude of the task ahead, Elisha makes a bold request. "Let me inherit a double portion of your spirit." This request was not for personal power or glory, but for divine empowerment to fulfill the calling God had given him. Elijah responds that his request will be granted, but with one condition: he must witness Elijah's departure. And then the most extraordinary moment occurs. As they walk and talk, a whirlwind accompanied by chariots and horses of fire separates them, and Elijah is taken up to heaven in a whirlwind. Elisha watches it all, crying out, my father, the chariots and horsemen of Israel." This exclamation is not just an emotional farewell. It acknowledges Elijah as the true defender of Israel, more powerful than any army or king. After Elijah's departure, Elisha picks up the mantle that had fallen and returns to the Jordan. He repeats Elijah's act, striking the waters with the mantle and proclaiming, "Where now is the Lord, the God of Elijah." The waters part once again, and Elisha crosses over, confirming that the same spirit that was with Elisha does. The prophets, observing from a distance, extol of Elijah on Elisha. This moment marks the beginning of Elisha's ministry as Israel's chief prophet. He now carries both the literal and symbolic mantle of Elijah, ready to face challenges and continue God's work. After Elijah's departure and the miracle of parting the Jordan's waters, Elisha embarks on his new mission as Israel's principal prophet. His journey is marked by signs and wonders that not only confirm God's Spirit upon him, but also demonstrate God's care for his people. These early miracles establish Elisha as a true messenger of God, showing that the same power that accompanied Elijah now works through him. In 2 Kings 2:19-22, we encounter Elisha's first public miracle following his succession. Arriving in Jericho, the townspeople approach him with an urgent concern. "The city's location is good, as my lord sees, but the water is bad, and the land is unproductive." 2 Kings 2:19. The city's water source was contaminated, causing infertility and disease, making life difficult for its inhabitants. Hearing this, Elisha asks for a new bowl filled with salt. Once brought to him, he goes to the main water source, throws the salt into it, and declares, "This is what the Lord says, I have healed this water. Never again will it cause death or unfruitfulness." 2 Kings 2:21. As the text concludes, the water has remained pure to this day, according to the word Elisha had spoken. So 2 Kings 2:22. This miracle was not only a demonstration of power, but also a spiritual message. The use of salt, ordinarily ineffective for purifying water, symbolized God's ability to transform what is barren into something fruitful and blessed. Elisha's act showed that he was indeed a representative of the living God, whose presence brings life and restoration. Shortly after, we encounter an episode that seems severe, but carries a profound meaning. In 2 Kings 2:23-25, as Elisha travels to Bethel, a group of youths mocks him, shouting, "Go up, Baldy! Go up, Baldy!" The term Baldy was likely an attempt to ridicule Elisha, disrespecting not only his appearance, but also his role as a prophet. By saying, "Go up," they may have been mocking Elijah's ascension and deriding the idea that Elisha possessed the same power and authority as his predecessor. Elisha turns and curses them in the name of the Lord. In response, 2 bears emerge from the forest and attack 42 of them. Though shocking, this event underscores the importance of respecting God's servants and his divine calling. This was not a personal act of revenge by Elisha, but a divine warning to Israel to revere the prophet chosen by God. The event further solidified Elisha's position as a man of God who should not be underestimated. Elisha's narrative continues with one of the most well-known miracles in his journey, described in 2 Kings 4:17. A widow of one of the prophet's disciples approaches Elisha in despair, explaining that her husband has died, leaving her heavily in debt. The creditors threaten to take her 2 sons as slaves to settle the debt. Elisha asks what she has in her house, and she replies, "Your servant has nothing there at all, except a small jar of olive oil." Elisha instructs her to borrow as many empty jars as possible from her neighbors, and with the help of her sons, begin filling them with her small supply of oil. Miraculously, the oil keeps flowing until all the jars are filled. Elisha then tells the widow to sell the oil, pay off her debts, and live on what remains. This miracle not only resolved the widow's financial crisis, but also illustrated how God can use limited resources to meet the needs of his children. It also teaches a valuable lesson about faith and obedience. The widow had to trust Elisha's word and act, even when the instructions seemed improbable. The story then takes us to Shunem, where Elisha encounters a wealthy and generous woman who insists on hosting him whenever he passes through her town. In 2 Kings 4:8-37, we see that this woman and her husband even build a small furnished room for Elisha to rest during his travels. Grateful for her kindness, Elisha seeks to reward her. When asked what she needs, she humbly declines, saying she lacks nothing. However, Elisha's servant Gehazi points out that she has no children and her husband is old. Elisha then prophesies that within a year she will hold a son in her arms. As promised, she gives birth to a son. Years later, the boy suddenly falls ill while in the fields with his father and dies in his mother's arms. Full of faith, the woman places her son's body in the room where Elisha stayed and sets out to find the prophet. When she finds Elisha, she clings to his feet, expressing her grief. Elisha sends Gehazi with his staff to revive the child, but it proves unsuccessful. Finally, Elisha goes to the room, prays to the Lord, and stretches himself out over the child, placing his mouth, eyes, and hands on the boy. The child's body begins to warm. Elisha gets up, prays again, and repeats the act. The boy sneezes 7 times and opens his eyes, restored to life. This miracle not only reaffirms God's power over life and death, but also reveals Elisha's compassion and his dedication to serving others. He not only delivered God's messages, but also deeply cared for those around him. Elisha's relationship with the Shunammite woman shows that his prophetic ministry was not just about confronting kings or performing great feats, but also about bringing hope and restoration to families. These events marked the beginning of Elisha's ministry, solidifying his position as a prophet of God. Each miracle served as evidence that the Spirit of the Lord was with him, bringing healing, provision, and life where there had been death and need. The narrative of Elisha's life continues to demonstrate the depth of his ministry and the way God worked through him, especially during moments of extreme need. His miracles during times of famine and crisis are emblematic of God's care for his people, showing that no circumstance is too great or too small for divine attention. Each of Elisha's actions during these challenging times reinforces his role as a prophet and underscores God's power manifested in provision and restoration. In 2 Kings 4:38-41, we find Elisha in a critical situation. A famine was devastating the land. He was in Gilgal with the sons of the prophets, a group of disciples under his spiritual leadership. During a gathering, Elisha instructed one of his servants to prepare a stew for the group. However, while gathering ingredients, one of the disciples unknowingly added a poisonous plant to the pot. When the stew was served, the men began eating, but soon realized something was wrong and cried out, "Man of God, there is death in the pot." The danger was real. The contaminated stew could have killed them. Elisha responded calmly, confident in God's power. He asked for some flour, which he threw into the pot, declaring that the food was now safe to eat. The men resumed eating, and the stew caused no harm. This miracle was not only a practical solution to an urgent problem, but also a demonstration that even in times of crisis, God is present to protect and provide. The flour itself had no healing properties, but served as a symbolic medium to showcase divine intervention. Shortly after this event, still in the same chapter, another moment of famine presented Elisha with a challenging situation. In 2 Kings 4:42-44, a man from Baal-Shalisha brought Elisha an offering, 20 barley loaves and some ears of grain. While this amount was substantial for an individual or a small family, it was clearly insufficient to feed the 100 men present. When Elisha instructed that the food be distributed, his servant questioned, "How can I set this before 100 men?" However, Elisha confidently replied, "Give it to the people to eat, for this is what the Lord says. They will eat and have some left over." And so it happened. The loaves and grain were served. Everyone ate their fill, and there was even some left over, just as Elisha had prophesied. This miracle, though less renowned, bears a striking resemblance to Jesus' miracle of feeding the multitude with loaves and fish, as recorded in the Gospels. Both events highlight God's ability to meet the physical needs of his people in miraculous ways, demonstrating that he is the provider in times of scarcity. On another occasion, described in 2 Kings 6:1-7, we see an event that may seem minor compared to the grand miracles of provision, but carries profound spiritual significance. The sons of the prophets were building a new meeting place, a project symbolizing the growth of their community and their commitment to God's work. While cutting wood near the Jordan River, one of the disciples accidentally dropped the axe head he was using into the water. The situation was especially distressing because the axe was borrowed and the young disciple had no means to replace it. He cried out in despair, "Oh no, my Lord, it was borrowed." Elisha, demonstrating that even the simplest problems are within God's attention, asked where the axe head had fallen. The young man pointed to the spot, and Elisha cut a piece of wood, threw it into the water, and the axe head floated to the surface. This miracle, though seemingly small in scale, conveys a powerful message. God cares about the everyday concerns of his people. No issue is too insignificant to be beyond his provision and care. These three events, the purification of the stew, the multiplication of the loaves, and the floating axe head, illustrate different facets of God's character. In the first, we see his protective power, ensuring that what was deadly became safe and useful. In the second, he is revealed as the provider, multiplying limited resources to fully meet the needs of many. In the third, he shows his attentive care, addressing a practical problem that, though minor, caused anxiety for one of his servants. Furthermore, each of these miracles reinforces Elisha's authority as a prophet of God. By acting with faith and confidence in divine intervention, Elisha demonstrated that his power did not originate from himself, but from the God he served. Those around him began to recognize not only his position as a spiritual leader, but also God's nearness in times of difficulty. Elisha's actions pointed to God not just with his words, but through his deeds, offering a living example of dependence and trust in the Lord. These stories also remind us that even in times of crisis and need, God never abandons his people. The famine that plagued the land was not enough to prevent God from meeting the needs of those who trusted in him. Whether protecting his servants from poison, multiplying food, or resolving seemingly small problems, God revealed himself as present and active. After each of these miracles, the figure of Elisha continues to stand out as an instrument of God in a time of great challenge. His acts of faith not only resolved immediate problems, but also pointed to something greater, God's faithfulness in sustaining his people and the necessity of trusting him in all circumstances. The story of Elisha is not limited to personal miracles or minor communal events. He also played a vital role during moments of military conflict, where God demonstrated his power and absolute control over nations through the prophet. Elisha became a key figure for the kings of Israel and neighboring nations, offering divine guidance that often made the difference between victory and defeat. His actions reveal that God not only cares for individual needs, but is also deeply involved in the destinies of peoples and nations. In 2 Kings 3, we find a significant episode that illustrates how God used Elisha to help in times of military crisis. King Jehoram of Israel allied with King Jehoshaphat of Judah and the king of Edom to fight against Moab, which had rebelled against Israel after King Ahab's death. During their march, the armies faced a serious problem, a complete lack of water for the soldiers and animals. Without water, the campaign seemed destined to fail before it even began. Desperate, the kings sought guidance from a prophet of the Lord. Jehoshaphat, known for his faith in God, asked, "Is there no prophet of the Lord here, through whom we may inquire of the Lord?" 2 Kings 3:11. One of the servants mentioned Elisha, saying that he had served Elijah and carried the word of God. The kings approached Elisha, but the prophet made it clear that he was willing to help only out of respect for Jehoshaphat. He said to Jehoram, "As surely as the Lord Almighty lives, whom I serve, if I did not have respect for the presence of Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, I would not pay any attention to you." 2 Kings 3:14. Elisha asked for a musician to be brought, and as the music played, the Spirit of the Lord came upon him. He prophesied that God would fill the valleys with water, even without rain or wind, ensuring the army's survival. Moreover, he announced that God would deliver Moab into their hands. The next morning, as Elisha had spoken, the valleys were filled with water. When the Moabites saw the water at sunrise, it appeared red like blood. Believing that the allied kings had turned on each other, the Moabites advanced unprepared and were defeated by the allied forces. This victory not only ensured the survival of the army, but also demonstrated God's sovereign intervention. He not only provided water at a critical moment, but also used the reflection to confuse the enemies and secure victory. Elisha's role as an advisor was crucial, as without his guidance, the kings would have faced certain defeat. Another significant event involving Elisha and military conflicts is found in 2 Kings 6:8-23, during the attacks of the king of Aram, Syria, on Israel. The king of Aram realized that his military plans were constantly being thwarted, as the king of Israel seemed to know his every move in advance. Suspecting betrayal within his own ranks, the king of Aram was informed that there were no traitors, but that Elisha, the prophet in Israel, was revealing his plans to the king of Israel, even what he discussed in secret. Determined to capture Elisha, the king of Aram sent a large army to surround the city of Dothan, where the prophet was staying. At dawn, Elisha's servant went out and saw the city completely surrounded by horses and chariots. Terrified, he exclaimed, "Oh no, my Lord, what shall we do?" Elisha, calm and confident in God, replied, "Don't be afraid. Those who are with us are more than those who are with them." He then prayed, "Lord, open his eyes so that he may see." God answered Elisha's prayer, and the servant's spiritual eyes were opened. He saw the hills full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha, representing God's heavenly army sent to protect them. This vision not only reassured the servant, but also demonstrated God's total control, even in desperate situations. Elisha prayed again, asking God to strike the Aramean soldiers with blindness, and God responded, incapacitating the enemy army. Elisha then went out to meet them and, with divine guidance, led them to Samaria, where they were surrounded by Israel's forces. When the Arameans regained their sight, they realized they were at the mercy of their enemies. The king of Israel, eager, asked Elisha if he should kill them, but the prophet gave a surprising response. "Do not kill them. Would you kill those you have captured with your own sword or bow? Set food and water before them so that they may eat and drink and then go back to their master." 2 Kings 6:22. The king of Israel obeyed, preparing a great feast for the Aramean soldiers. After eating and drinking, they were released. This act of mercy, orchestrated by Elisha, not only spared lives, but also diffused the conflict. The text concludes by stating that the Aramean raids against Israel ceased for some time. These episodes highlight the complexity of Elisha's role in military conflicts. He was not merely a strategic advisor, but also a representative of God's character, which is both just and merciful. In both cases, with the Moabites and the Arameans, victory did not come through human strength or skill, but through divine intervention. Elisha served as a channel for this intervention, demonstrating that Israel's true strength lay not in its armies, but in the Lord. Furthermore, Elisha's actions demonstrate that God is not just a God of war, but also of peace and reconciliation. The decision to feed the Syrian soldiers instead of killing them is a powerful example of how God can transform enemies into allies. The release of the soldiers also echoes Jesus' later teaching about loving one's enemies and doing good to those who persecute us. Once again, Elisha points to a broader vision of God's character, revealing his justice, power, and compassion. The story of Naaman, recounted in 2 Kings 5, is one of the most spiritually rich episodes in Elisha's ministry. This account introduces us to a foreign commander, a seemingly incurable disease, obedience that brings healing, and a confrontation with greed and integrity. Every detail of this narrative reveals God's power not only to heal physically, but also to transform hearts. The story begins with the introduction of Naaman, the commander of the army of the king of Syria. In 2 Kings 5:1, we learn that he was a powerful and respected man, a great man before his master, because through him the Lord had given victory to Syria. However, despite all his success and influence, Naaman suffered from leprosy, a terrible disease that not only debilitated physically, but also carried a social stigma. Even in his prestigious position, Naaman faced a problem that neither his power nor his wealth could solve. The story takes a turn when a young Israelite slave girl who had been captured in a Syrian raid speaks to Naaman's wife about a prophet in Israel who could heal him. In 2 Kings 5:3, she says, "If only my master were with the prophet who is in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy." These words of faith, spoken by a young girl in a position of complete insignificance, set off a chain of events that would change Naaman's life. Desperate for a solution, Naaman takes the message to the king of Syria, who immediately sends a letter to the king of Israel requesting that the commander be healed. Along with the letter, Naaman brings a large sum of money and gifts, believing that healing could be bought. The king of Israel's reaction is one of despair. In 2 Kings 5:7, he tears his robes and exclaims, "Am I God to kill and make alive, that this man sends word to me to cure a man of his leprosy?" This response highlights the king of Israel's inability, but also sets the stage for Elisha to enter the narrative as God's true instrument. When Elisha hears about the situation, he sends a message to the king, saying, "Let him come to me, that he may know that there is a prophet in Israel." 2 Kings 5:8. Naaman then goes to Elisha's house, but the prophet does not come out to meet him personally. Instead, he sends a messenger with a simple instruction: "Go, wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh shall be restored, and you shall be clean." 2 Kings 5:10. Naaman's reaction is one of indignation. He expected Elisha to come out, call upon the name of the Lord, perform a grand gesture, and heal him. Moreover, he scorns the Jordan River, considering it inferior to the rivers of Syria like Abana and Pharpar. In 2 Kings 5:11-12, Naaman says, "I thought that he would surely come out to me and stand and call upon the name of the Lord his God and wave his hand over the place and cure the leper. Are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean?" Then he turns and goes away in a rage. However, Naaman's servants persuade him to reconsider. They say, "My father, if the prophet had told you to do something great, would you not have done it? How much more then when he tells you, 'Wash and be clean'?" 2 Kings 5:13. Naaman then goes down to the Jordan River and, obeying Elisha's word, dips himself 7 times. In 2 Kings 5:14, we read that his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. Naaman's physical healing is remarkable, but the spiritual transformation that occurs is even more significant. He returns to Elisha declaring, "Now I know that there is no God in all the earth except in Israel." 2 Kings 5:15. This confession is a testament to God's power and the impact Elisha had in revealing the Lord's glory to foreign peoples. Naaman offers gifts to Elisha in gratitude, but the prophet refuses, emphasizing that the healing was a work of God, not something that could be purchased. However, the story does not end there. Elisha's servant, Gehazi, succumbs to greed. He chases after Naaman and lies, saying that Elisha had changed his mind and requested 2 talents of silver and 2 changes of clothes. Naaman, generous after his healing, gives Gehazi more than he asked for. Gehazi hides the gifts, but he cannot hide his actions from Elisha. In 2 Kings 5:26-27, Elisha confronts Gehazi, saying, "Did not my spirit go with you when the man turned from his chariot to meet you? Was it a time to accept money and garments, olive orchards and vineyards, sheep and oxen, male servants and female servants? Therefore the leprosy of Naaman shall cling to you and to your descendants forever." Gehazi leaves Elisha's presence leprous, as white as snow. This story highlights several important aspects of Elisha's ministry and God's character. First, it reveals that obedience to God's word, even when it seems simple or humiliating, is the path to restoration. Naaman had to overcome his pride and trust in God's method to experience healing. Second, the account demonstrates that God's power is not limited to Israel, but extends to all nations. Naaman's conversion is evidence that the Lord desires all to recognize his sovereignty. On the other hand, Gehazi's punishment is a sobering reminder of the importance of integrity in ministry. Gehazi's greed not only brought judgment upon himself, but also contrasted with Naaman's generosity and Elisha's humility. This episode reinforces that God's servants must reflect his character in all areas of their lives, as their actions directly impact the message they convey to the world. The story of Naaman and Gehazi concludes with a clear lesson. God is a God of power, grace, and justice. He heals the sick, transforms hearts, and calls his servants to holiness. These events in Elisha's life continue to highlight the prophet's role as a channel of divine revelation, demonstrating that the Lord is sovereign over life, death, and even the hardest of hearts. Elisha's life was marked by extraordinary miracles, acts of provision, healing, and victories that displayed God's power. Yet, like every human, Elisha faced mortality. In 2 Kings 13:14, we read that Elisha became ill with the sickness that would lead to his death. Now Elisha had been suffering from the illness from which he died. Despite his remarkable ministry and the constant display of God's power through him, the prophet ultimately succumbed to the frailty of human condition. The narrative of Elisha's death is brief but significant. Even while ill and in his final days, Elisha remains a counselor to the people of Israel. In 2 Kings 13:14-19, we see King Jehoash of Israel visiting him, lamenting the prophet's impending loss and saying, my father, the chariots of Israel and their horsemen." This phrase echoes Elisha's own cry when Elijah was taken up to heaven, connecting these two great prophets and acknowledging Elisha's role as Israel's true spiritual defender. Even on his deathbed, Elisha delivers one last prophecy. He instructs Jehoash to shoot an arrow out of the window toward the east, symbolizing victory over the Arameans. Then he asks the king to strike the ground with the arrows. Jehoash strikes the ground only 3 times, and Elisha, angered, says, "You should have struck the ground 5 or 6 times. Then you would have defeated Aram and completely destroyed it. But now you will defeat it only 3 times." 2 Kings 13:19. This prophecy, given in Elisha's final moments, reflects his mission to the end, to lead Israel to victory and demonstrate God's power. Elisha dies and is buried in Israel. However, his influence and the manifestation of God's power through him do not end with his death. In 2 Kings 13:20-21, we find one of the Bible's most mysterious and extraordinary episodes. After Elisha's death, Israel continues to face threats from their enemies, including raids by Moabite bands during springtime. During one of these incursions, a group of men is burying an Israelite. In urgency, upon seeing a group of enemies approaching, they hastily throw the body into Elisha's tomb and flee. What happens next is described succinctly, but is of profound spiritual significance. In 2 Kings 13:21, we read, "Once, while some Israelites were burying a man, suddenly they saw a band of raiders. So they threw the man's body into Elisha's tomb. When the body touched Elisha's bones, the man came to life and stood up on his feet. This miracle is unique, as it is the only resurrection in the Bible that occurs through the remains of someone without any direct action or prayer at the moment. This extraordinary event raises several important reflections. First, it demonstrates that God's power is not limited by the life or death of his servants. Even after Elisha's death, God continues to perform miracles through him, showing that the impact of those who live in obedience to God can transcend their earthly existence. Elisha's bones had no power in themselves, but served as a vehicle for God's power to manifest, underscoring that the true author of the miracle is the Lord. Additionally, this resurrection points to the eternal nature of God's work. Elisha lived as a man obedient to and aligned with God's purposes, and even after his death, his spiritual legacy remained. This event not only reaffirms Elisha's ministry, but also foreshadows God's power over death, fully revealed in Jesus Christ. Just as Elisha's bones brought life to a dead man, Christ's resurrection would bring eternal life to all who believe in him. The spiritual significance of this resurrection also teaches us about the eternal impact of a life lived for God. Elisha sought no personal glory during his life. He consistently pointed to God as the source of power and authority. Even in death, God used the testimony of his life to display his power and care for Israel. This reminds us that a life dedicated to the Lord does not end when our physical bodies die. Our spiritual legacy can continue to influence and impact those around us. This miracle also reinforces God's sovereignty in times of crisis. The men who threw the body into Elisha's tomb were in a moment of desperation, seeking to escape their enemies. They did not anticipate a miracle, but God, in His grace, intervened in a surprising way. This reminds us that God can act in any situation, even in the most chaotic and unexpected circumstances, to demonstrate His power and purpose. Although the Bible provides no further details about the man who was resurrected, we can imagine that his experience served as a powerful testimony to the God of Israel. The fact that this story is recorded in 2 Kings shows that it had a lasting impact on the memory of the people. It was a reminder that the Lord was present and active, even in times of difficulty and apparent silence. Following this miraculous account, the biblical narrative of Elisha comes to an end. However, the impact of his life and ministry echoes throughout the Old Testament and even into the New Testament, where parallels can be drawn between Elisha's miracles and those of Jesus. Elisha was a faithful servant, a man who lived to point people to God. His ministry was a constant demonstration that the Lord is sovereign, powerful, and trustworthy. Even in death, Elisha continued to bear witness to God's glory, showing that the impact of a life dedicated to Him cannot be confined, not even by the grave. The life and ministry of Elisha play a central role not only in the history of Israel, but also in the broader narrative of God's revelation to humanity. By comparing Elisha with other prophets and observing the parallels between his miracles and the ministry of Jesus, it becomes evident that Elisha was not merely Elijah's successor, but also a figure pointing to the Messiah. His story is rich with meaning, and the events recorded in the book of 2 Kings reveal that his life was a foreshadowing of Christ's power and mission. Elisha's relationship with Elijah is one of the most natural comparisons. Elijah is often remembered as Israel's greatest prophet, a man who confronted kings, performed mighty miracles, and had an extraordinary end, being taken to heaven in a whirlwind. 2 Kings 2:11. However, Elisha's story demonstrates that he not only continued Elijah's work, but also carried out a ministry that in many respects surpassed it. When Elisha asked for a double portion of Elijah's spirit in 2 Kings 2:9, he was not seeking superiority, but rather the empowerment necessary to fulfill the immense calling before him. This request was granted, as evidenced by the biblical record. Elijah performed around 7 miracles, while Elisha performed at least twice as many. From the purification of Jericho's waters in 2 Kings 2:19-22 to the resurrection of a man after his own death in 2 Kings 13:21, Elisha's miracles covered a wide range of situations and needs. These included acts of provision, such as the multiplication of the widow's oil in 2 Kings 4:1-7, acts of healing, such as Naaman's cleansing from leprosy in 2 Kings 5, and acts of protection, such as blinding the Syrian army in 2 Kings 6:18-23. This abundance of miracles reflects the double portion Elisha received, demonstrating the powerful working of God's Spirit through him. More significant than the number of miracles, however, is their spiritual and symbolic impact. Just as Elijah symbolized the direct confrontation of idolatry and corruption, Elisha stood as a symbol of God's provision and restoration. While Elijah often faced off against kings and false prophets, Elisha deeply engaged with the needs of ordinary people, showing that God not only rules over nations, but also cares for each individual. This shift from Elijah's focus to Elisha's reflects the continuity of the prophetic calling in Israel and the evolving nature of God's relationship with his people. The parallels between Elisha and Jesus are particularly striking. Many of Elisha's miracles bear remarkable similarities to those performed by Jesus in the New Testament, suggesting that Elisha prefigured Christ. For example, in 2 Kings 4:42-44, Elisha multiplies 20 barley loaves to feed 100 men, an act that foreshadows Jesus' multiplication of loaves and fish recorded in all four Gospels: Matthew 14:13-21, Mark 6:30-44, Luke 9:10-17, and John 6:1-14. Both miracles not only demonstrate God's power to provide, but also carry a deeper spiritual message. God is the ultimate source of sustenance and life for his people. Another notable example is the healing of Naaman's leprosy in 2 Kings 5, which parallels Jesus' healing of 10 lepers in Luke 17:11-19. In both stories, physical healing is accompanied by a spiritual acknowledgement of God's sovereignty. In Naaman's case, his confession that there is no God in all the earth but in Israel, 2 Kings 5:15, reflects the faith that Jesus sought in those he healed. The resurrection of the Shunammite woman's son in 2 Kings 4:32-37 also echoes in the New Testament, where Jesus raises the widow's son in Nain, Luke 7:11-17. Both Elisha and Jesus demonstrated God's power over death, a central theme of biblical revelation. These resurrections are signs that God is the source of life and point to the ultimate victory over death through Christ's resurrection. Beyond the parallels in miracles, Elisha's ministry reflects aspects of Jesus' character. Elisha was an accessible prophet, often involved in the day-to-day lives of people. He helped a widow in financial distress, advised kings in times of war, restored the health of a foreign commander, and even addressed seemingly small problems such as a lost axe head in the Jordan River, 2 Kings 6:1-7. This compassionate and practical approach mirrors how Jesus interacted with people, addressing their physical, emotional, and spiritual needs. At the same time, Elisha also pointed to God's holiness and justice. The episode with Gehazi in 2 Kings 5:20-27, where the servant's greed was punished with leprosy, shows that the prophetic ministry was not only about miracles, but also about living according to God's standards. Similarly, Jesus often called his followers to lives of holiness, urging them to repent and remain faithful. Elisha's impact extends beyond his miracles and teachings. He was a central figure in Israel's history during a time of transition and hardship, showing that God was present and active even amidst internal and external challenges. His life is a testament that God uses ordinary people to accomplish extraordinary things when they fully commit to his call. The connection between Elisha and Jesus also highlights the continuity of God's message throughout history. Just as Elisha pointed to something greater yet to come, every miracle, prophecy, and act of compassion he performed foreshadowed Christ's redemptive work. Elisha's life reminds us that God is continuously at work, revealing his plan of salvation and restoring his people. While Elisha's ministry ended with his death, the resurrection that occurred at his tomb in 2 Kings 13:21 serves as a powerful symbol that the impact of those who follow God continues even after their departure. His life was a constant demonstration of God's power and the hope he offers to all who trust in him. Elisha not only fulfilled his role as a prophet, but also left a legacy that points directly to Christ, showing that faithfulness to God brings provision, protection, and restoration, both in the present and in eternity. Elisha's story teaches us that God can use ordinary people to accomplish extraordinary things. His life was marked by miracles, courage, obedience, and unwavering faith in the Lord. Above all, Elisha shows us that God is always present, taking care of his people, whether in times of abundance or moments of need. If you have been touched by this incredible journey and believe that this message can impact others' lives, subscribe to the channel to follow more inspiring stories like this one. Don't forget to like the video and share it with your friends and family Together, let's spread the message that God continues to work in our lives, bringing provision, protection, and hope. See you in the next video, and may you continue to find inspiration and strength in God's Word.